Hello viewers, welcome to week 5, lecture 4 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and in this lecture I am going to continue the discussion of the ideas of Claude Lévi-Strauss, and here we will be talking about Strauss's study of myth, how he looks at the study of myth in terms of linguistics or structural linguistics, as well as his idea of the savage mind. So, Strauss believes that language is a semantic system par excellence, and it signifies, it exists because of its signification. It only signifies. So, he says that very much like linguistics, anthropology is also not concerned with the surface life of phenomena. It is interested in going into the unconscious structures of those phenomena. Right. So he says that mere empiricism is not enough. Mere naturalism is also misleading. So the method is to evolve or to attain what is called the Lang behind all systems, or Lang behind all individual manifestations of various forms of culture, right? So in this way, Strauss is going to demonstrate the efficacy of the unconscious foundation, and to make that point, to demonstrate that point, he takes the examples of shamans in primitive societies. Shaman means men of medicine. And Strauss goes on to say, as we know that how Strauss is always interested in demonstrating the superiority of those primitive men, as Vico had done in his work. Similarly, here Strauss goes on to show that how shamans' method of curing patients, particularly men or women who suffered from certain kinds of illnesses in those primitive societies, they were not arbitrary, they were not illogical, they were very much causal, as we find in modern sciences. For example, in modern sciences, we find that always people try to ascertain the relationship of a disease with its cause. For example, certain germs, bacteria, viruses are responsible for this disease, and in this way that disease is cured or that disease is tried to be treated. Similarly, here we find that these shamans, they also try to correlate the problems of patients, particularly diseases of women, with various myths which they believed in. And in those myths, whatever characters were there, whether they were heroes or monsters, because these people believed in those myths, so a shaman tried to cure these people of their ailments by reintegrating them to those myths, and we will look into that. So in this way, their method was not very different from the methods of modern science that we find. He says that those women, they believed in those myths, and so the mythology of the shaman does not correspond to an objective reality, does not matter. The Sikh woman believes in the myth and belongs to a society which believes in it. And in this way, there are a number of spirits that woman believes in. So he says that the tutelary spirits and malevolent spirits, or the supernatural monsters and magical animals, they all are part of a coherent system on which the native conception of the universe is founded. So in this way, the Sikh woman accepts these mythical beings, or more accurately, we can say that she has never questioned their existence. What she does not accept are incoherent and arbitrary pains, which are an alien element in her system, but which the shaman calling upon the myth will reintegrate with a whole where everything is meaningful. So, here we find that once the sick woman understands, however, she does more than resign herself and she gets well. So, Shashur goes on to say that the pain or the problems or the ailment with which that woman is suffering, she believes that she suffers because of things because she is unable to relate it or connect with her belief system. So, the role of shaman is to make that woman correlate that pain or ailment with the system that she believes in. And in this way, once she is psychologically or physiologically reintegrated to that system, and because of that reintegration, that ailment is cured, that problem is solved. Strauss goes on to say that what shaman does in this process. Shaman gives that woman a language in terms of relating her to the myths and other phenomena. So, in this way, the shaman gives her a language with which she is able to express what is unexpressible or inexpressible. So, in this way, her experience becomes order when she tries to reintegrate herself to that myth system. And this release of physiological process, or we can say reorganization of all those ideas in a favorable direction. So, that is how that sick woman is cured, or that is how she is treated. So, in this way we find that Strauss tries to establish a relationship between myth and language. He says that this savage mind, it reveals itself in the structures of its myths and language. He says that when we look at various myths of those primitive societies, so naturally there were attempts to interpret those myths. And what happens when people try to interpret those myths? Naturally there will be conflicts, because one interpretation will declare that this is the authentic interpretation and that is inauthentic interpretation. So, in this way there was a situation of conflict, there was a situation of fighting. So, they have been, Strauss says that in this way myth should be looked upon as collective dreams or basic of ritual, which is a result of aesthetic play. For example, people believed in those myths, they have been seen, those myths have been seen as collective dream, as the basis of ritual, as the result of a kind of aesthetic play. And in those myths, what we find that those mythological figures, they have been considered as either divine figures, divinized figures, sometimes they are considered as personified abstractions, or sometimes they are seen as fallen gods. So, what Strauss is trying to say, that the way these people believed in those myths, we cannot consider them as very casual relationship of their understanding in those myths. He says that these myths cannot be taken as children's play games, right? So, these myths are reflective of the formative mind of those people, how those minds were capable of creating reality. And he goes on to say that these myths had a very sophisticated relationship with the world and with the society which generates those myths. So, in this way, he says that why the structuring of myth is important, why it is necessary to reach or to attain that unconscious structures of those myths. So why? Because it will put a kind of restriction on the profusion of those myths, which are spread in form of many stories. So, in this way, once these myths are reduced to manageable number of recurrent elements, right, who has genuine structure and structuring significance. So, here we find that his concern is ultimately with the extent to which the structures of myth, as they are known to men, how they resolve these dualities between nature and culture, right? So, here we find that Levi-Strauss says whether the myth is recreated by the individual or borrowed from tradition, it derives from its sources, individual or collective, only the stock of representation with which it operates. But the structure remains the same, and through it, the symbolic function is fulfilled. There are many languages, but very few structural laws which are valid for all languages. So, a compilation of known tales and myths would fill an imposing number of volumes, but they can be reduced to a small number of simple types if we abstract from among the diversity of characters a few elementary functions. So, here we find that how Strauss is interested in the elementary functions and determinations. However, Strauss goes on to say that when we are talking about these elementary functions, many times the determination of these elementary functions, they have a problem because of the nature of those given myths. So, he says that on the one hand, it would seem that in the course of a myth, anything is likely to happen. There is no logic, no continuity, any characteristic can be attributed to any subject. Every conceivable relationship can be found. With myth, everything becomes possible. But on the other hand, this apparent arbitrariness is belied by the astounding similarity between myths collected in widely different regions. So, if the content of a myth is contingent, how are we going to explain the fact that myths throughout the world are so similar, right? So, here we find that how he is trying to establish a structure of myths. So, he says that myth is very much like language, and if a myth is to be known, a myth needs to be told, and that is what he calls structural linguistics, which is very much like the study of myth in those ways. So, he says that Strauss goes on to say that this analogy is not exact. It is like but different from language. He says that this comparison between myth and language is not a very valid comparison. He says that myth and language, they are similar, but in many ways they are not similar as well. For example, so far as a myth is concerned, in a myth, its syntactical structure or the way things are narrated or organized, it hardly matters. The myth value can be expressed even by a very simple kind of interpretation of that myth or revelation of that myth, right? So, the myth is like a language, but at the same time it is different from language. He says that if we look at the structures of these myths, you find two patterns, sameness and difference. The same thing that we had found in the study of phonemes in structural linguistics. So, in this way, the attempt is to attain the lang of those myths. For example, Strauss undertakes the study of that Oedipus myth. He says that the total Oedipus myth can be taken as a lang, and various interpretations of that Oedipus myth, as we find in different places like Oedipus the Rex or Oedipus at Colonus or Antigone, they can be taken as paroles. Further, Strauss goes on to say that if we look at those myths, you'll find that those myths are very much located in time because they are being narrated at a particular time or they are being reused at a particular given time. If Sophocles is writing Oedipus the Kings or Oedipus the Rex or Oedipus at Colonus or Antigone, he is writing it at a particular time. So in this way, that myth belongs to that time. But at the same time, if we look at the overall structure of that Oedipus myth, it is timeless, it is trans-historical, it is trans-social, right? So, he says that a myth has both qualities. It is very much structured in time, it is located in time because it patterns of events. But if we look at the objective patterns and events of the total Oedipus myth, it is, beyond time. So it is something which in its present form contains both the past as well as the futures. So in this way, he reaches the conclusion that a myth has both. It has a lang as well as a parole, right? So he says that in this way, myth is very much unlike poetry. Myth does not suffer from translation. And that is what we were talking about, that a myth, even if it is, uttered in a poor language, the mythical value will be communicated. So in this way, we find that how in myth we also find all these things, and how myths are also transformational. So there must be, and there is, a correspondence between the unconscious meaning of a myth, the problem it tries to solve, and the conscious content it makes use of to reach that end. That is the plot. However, this correspondence should not always be conceived as a kind of mirror image. It can also appear as a transformation. That is what Strauss says. Strauss goes on to say that there are two essential features of a myth. The first feature, he says, the meaning of mythology can't reside in the isolated elements which constitute the myth, but must inhere in the way in which those elements are combined, and must take account of the potential for transformation that such a combination involves. So here we find that, he is talking about myth in terms of lang and parole, in terms of items and their relationship to the whole structure of myth. The other property of myth, or essential feature of myth, that Strauss says, he says that language in myth exhibits specific properties which are above the ordinary linguistic level. And in this way, that we find that how in Saussure's analysis, phonemes, morphemes, as we find them in the study of structural linguistics, similarly he evolves the concept of mythemes, the smallest units, and their relationship with larger structures. So here we find that how Strauss's method of study is very much like Propp's method of study. Like Propp had, we had seen in formalism, and how we had realized that Propp is a direct link between the formalistic method and the structuralist method of study. So here Strauss is also trying to do a similar thing with Oedipus myth that we will be taking. He is saying that, he is saying that we can break down a large number of myths into smallest possible units, and each unit consists a kind of function. For example, Oedipus kills his father, and in this way, this unit's function, it is related to the overall structure of the myth, as well as he is saying that these constituent parts, they create a cluster of bundles, and all these clusters, they are related to each other in different manifestations of myth. So like phoneme, mytheme is also a bundle of this sort, and it is behind each lang parole. So in this way, he is saying that in the study of myth, there is a super lang which emits the fundamental message. And let us see that how Saussure takes on the study of Oedipus myth, and how he tries to understand that Oedipus myth in terms of, Saussure's structuralist method. So if we look at this myth, it exists in two axes, diachronic axis and synchronic axis. So we find that there are 4 columns, and 4 rows. These columns are arranged slightly different as they are in the original book of Strauss. We can make sense of that. So, here we find that if we look at the first relation, right. So, we are confronted here with 4 vertical columns, and each of which includes several relations belonging to the same bundle. So, were we to tell the myth, we would disregard the columns and read the rows from left to right and from top to bottom. But if we want to understand the myth, then we will have to disregard one half of the diachronic dimension, that is from top to bottom, and read it from left to right, column after column, each being considered as a unit. So, if we look at this method, we find that here, we are not concerned with what is true, authentic or earliest version of the myth. Strauss says that is a mistaken quest. For example, if we genuinely define the myth as consisting of all its version, it will remain the same as long as it fit to do so. So, we are not concerned with the genuine version of myth, rather we are concerned with the lang of the myth that lies behind all paroles. And in this way, Strauss's reading of the above mythemic structure is highly contentious. However, let us see that what he does. And here he says that, if we, how this structure is very much in accordance with Saussures' structure of associative or vertical and syntagmatic or horizontal dimensions of language. And we will see that how they can also be identified with metaphoric and metonymic dimensions, as we can see. So, if we look at all these relationships, all the relationships belonging to the same column exhibit one common feature that we see here. For example, all the events which are grouped in the first column, we can notice that they are, overemphasizing blood relationships. For example, these blood relationships are intimate, but they are more intimate than they should be. For example, Cadmus seeking his sister Europa ravished by Zeus, or Oedipus marries his mother Jocasta, or Antigone marries her brother Polynices despite prohibition. Similarly, if the first column we can see is concerned with the overrating of blood relations, we find that the second column is is related to underrating of blood relations. So, what is there in the first column? It is inverted in the second column. Here we find that how members are killing each other. For example, Spatoi kill one another, or how Oedipus kills his own father Laius, or how Eteocles kills his brother Polynices. So, here underrating of blood relationship. In the third column we find that how monster, Cadmus kills dragon or Oedipus kills the sphinx. So, how monsters are being slain or killed, and in the fourth column we find that how naming is done. Here individual names are not important, how all these characters they are identified and they are identical because of certain kind of disability, right. So, here we find that this structural myth is something, this study is something, it is very illuminating, right. So, here we find that how these basic structure, this is the basic structure of the Oedipus myth, and all works can be taken as variations of that basic structure. So, how there is a relationship of oppositions, and in this way Strauss comes to that theoretical proposition that mythical thought always progresses from the awareness of oppositions towards their resolution. The other concept that Strauss discusses is the savage mind. And what is important about savage mind? He is saying that savage mind was very precious mind, primitive mind was very precious mind. And Strauss goes on to say that usually when we look at savage people, when we look at primitive people, we always try to declare that they were, we try to look at those people in very negative terms, in the sense that they were not civilized. So they were non-civilized, they were pre-industrial, they were not acquainted with the methods of writing. So they were less advanced people, they were backward people. However, Strauss is trying to make this point that they were superior people. Why? Because they had concrete relations among them. Their relationship with each other were not, effected through intermediaries. Their knowledge of the world was, first-hand knowledge, as Vico had said in his work, New Science. So in their, world, we find there is a direct reconstruction of reality. The storytellers were there, the priests were there, wise men were there. They were telling something, and directly reality was constituted or constructed. But what is the problem with the modern man? The problem with the modern man that we have always intermediaries. Our knowledge of things is always, we lack that concrete relations among men, among individuals. For example, the reality that we grasp through the books, through the libraries, and in this way, that is major difference. And he says, Strauss goes on to say that how this development of writing or invention of writing, it may be a miraculous discovery for human beings, but he says that it deprives humanity of something that is what he calls the savage mind. The savage mind is a mind which, is capable of thinking in terms of analogies and homologies. So with the advent of the writing, this very skill is snatched from humanity, right? He describes this savage mind is a mind which has a capacity to invent totems, thinking by inventing totems. In his work Totemism and the Savage Mind, he says that how thinking in terms of other species, humanity is deprived of that thing. And in this way, writing has snatched this from the savage mind. It has destroyed the savage mind, which was a superior mind. And in these two works, Totemism and the Savage Mind, he gives the concept of bricolage. Bricolage means a means of relating to the natural world. He says that it has a logic of its own. If I say I am a bear, as was said by the primitive men, so it is not an illogical statement. He goes on to say that this bricolier constructs the totemic message whereby nature and culture are caused to mirror each other. So in this way, this savage mind is analogical mind. It was a mind with multiple consciousness or multi-conscious mind, right? So this thinking in terms of analogies and homologies, it is a peculiar feature of the savage mind. And he says that if we look at that tendency, we find that what is involved here, the reciprocity of perspectives, in which man and the world mirror each other by means of classificatory systems, which operate as system of meaning. And he goes on to say this analogical thought, it works by imposing on the world a series of structural contrast and opposition. So here we find that how whether the ideas of Vico or ideas of Saussure, they are being echoed through these things. So he goes on to say that oppositions are analogically related in that their differences are felt to resemble each other. For example, up and down, it is in relationship with hot and cold, or raw and cooked. It will offer an insight into the nature of particular reality that each culture perceives. Strauss is talking about various sets of contrast and how there are similarities, analogies between those sets of contrast. He says that one very common analogy is what is edible and inedible, and how this analogy that at a given place something is called edible, the other is called inedible. And suppose if we compare it with a foreigner comes here. So foreigner and native, that is another set of contrast. For native, it is edible, for foreigner, it is inedible. So in this way, how these kinds of contrast or homologies can be understood between different system of differences. So, he defines totemism or savage ways of thinking, and he says that it is lying dormant in all men. So, universal human mind is primarily a savage mind, right? And it emerges clearly in fictive acts such as in stories and myths of those primitive people, as well as in manifestation of civilized society in forms of plays, poems, and other things. So in this way, with this, I come to the end of this lecture, and we have been able to, discuss all the concept of Levi-Strauss, whether it is his study of myth or the savage mind in this lecture. Earlier we had covered, or we had talked about, his study of elementary kinship and how the methods and principles of linguistics, structural linguistics, are applied to the study of anthropology. And in this way, Strauss emerges as one of the strongest propounders of this movement called structuralism. Thank you.